Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey, dear friends, picture this. You're lying in the dark, nearly asleep, and you hear it. That soft, rhythmic purr beside you. Maybe there's a warm weight on your chest or curled against your legs. A cat. Your cat. Just another Tuesday night. But here's what's wild. That creature purring next to you is the end result of a journey that spans 12,000 years. Its ancestors stalked the shadows of the world's first cities, rode in the cargo holds of Viking longships, survived witch hunts and plagues, and somehow convinced humans to build entire civilizations around their comfort. And we barely noticed it happening. Today, there are over 600 million domestic cats living on Earth. They're in penthouses in Dubai, fishing villages in Japan, farms in Iowa, apartments in Sao Paulo. They've colonized every continent except Antarctica. And honestly, they'd probably manage that too if we just build them a heated research station. But if you had looked at the world 12,000 years ago, there were no house cats. Zero. Just wild predators in the Middle Eastern wilderness who wanted absolutely nothing to do with humans. So what happened? How did we get from there to here? From wild hunters who avoided people and animals that deliberately seek out our laps, our beds, our warmest spots by the fire? The story you're about to hear isn't what you think. It's not really about us domesticating cats. That's the thing. We didn't domesticate them. Not the way we domesticated dogs, or horses, or cows. Those animals we actively bred and shaped and controlled over thousands of years. Cats domesticated themselves. And that changes everything. See, most people think ancient humans saw a cute wildcat and decided to make it a pet. That's not how it happened. What actually happened was far stranger and far more interesting. Around 10,000 BC, humans in the Fertile Crescent figured out agriculture. We stopped wandering around, hunting and gathering, and we started staying in one place, growing grain, storing food. And you know what loved stored grain? Mice, rats, rodents of every description. They descended on our grain stores like an army. And you know what loves mice and rats? Wildcats. So these small wild cats, Felis silvestris libica, started hanging around human settlements, not because they liked us, but because we'd accidentally created an all-you-can-eat buffet of their favorite prey. The boldest ones, the ones who would tolerate being near humans without freaking out, got access to the best hunting grounds. They ate well. They had more kittens. And those kittens inherited their parents' slightly lower fear humans. Generation after generation, the cats that were just a little bit friendlier, just a little bit calmer around people thrived. And we let them because they were solving our rodent problem. It was a perfect partnership. Except nobody planned it. It just happened. But here's where the questions get really interesting. Did the ancient Egyptians actually worship cats? Or is that a myth we've blown out of proportion? How did cats survive the Middle Ages when the Catholic Church declared them servants of Satan? Why are there cat cafes in every major city, but dog cafes never quite caught on? How did an animal that humans never fully controlled become one of the most successful mammals on the planet? And here's the biggest mystery of all. After 12,000 years of living with humans, cats are still only semi-domesticated. Dogs have been shaped by human breeding into hundreds of wildly different forms. Great Danes and Chihuahuas barely look like the same species. But a tabby cat in your living room could still survive in the wild tomorrow if it had to. Put a golden retriever in the forest, and it'll be confused and scared. Put a house cat in the forest, and it'll hunt, kill, and thrive. So who really domesticated who? Maybe the better question is, did cats look at early human civilization and decide we were useful enough to keep around? Let's go back. Way back to a time before cities, before kingdoms, before anyone had ever heard a purr in the dark and felt comforted by it. 10,000 BC. The world is warming. Ice sheets that have covered half of Europe and Asia for 100,000 years are finally retreating. Sea levels are rising. Coastlines are shifting. And in a crescent-shaped region stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, something revolutionary is about to happen. Humans are about to stop wandering and start settling down. They don't know it yet, but when they do, they're going to need help. And that help is going to come from a small, tawny-colored predator that's been watching them from the shadows for thousands of years. Meet Felis silvestris libica, the African wildcat. your cat's great-great-great-great-grandmother, going back about 10,000 generations. She weighs maybe 8 pounds, stands about 10 inches at the shoulder, and could fit comfortably in your backpack. She has sandy-colored fur with faint stripes on her legs and tail, a white belly, and eyes that glow amber in the firelight of human camps. She's a solitary hunter. She doesn't need anyone. She's been surviving just fine on her own for hundreds of thousands of years. But she's about to make a choice that will change everything. Not just for her species, but for humanity itself. The genetic evidence is remarkable. In 2007, researchers analyzed the DNA of nearly 1,000 domestic cats from around the world, along with samples from all 5 subspecies of wild cats. They were looking for the origin point, the ancestral population that gave rise to every house cat alive today. What they found was surprising, not because it was ambiguous, but because it was so clear. Every domestic cat, from Maine Coons to Siamese, from Egyptian mouse to random alley cats in Tokyo, they all trace their maternal lineage back to Felis silvestris libica, the African wild cat. And not just any African wild cats, but specifically populations living in the Near East in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent. This is where the story really begins. Picture the landscape. It's not the desert you might imagine when you hear Near East or Middle East. 10,000 years ago, this region is lush. Rolling grasslands stretch for hundreds of miles. Oak forests cover the hillsides. Rivers flow year-round, fed by mountain snowmelt and seasonal rains. Wild wheat and barley grow in dense stands across the valleys. Herds of gazelle graze the plains. Wild boar root through the forests. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there are rodents, mice, rats, voles, gerbils, ground squirrels. They're thriving in this post-ice age abundance, multiplying faster than the predators can keep them in check. And the wild cats are in heaven. A solitary African wild cat needs to catch about 4 or 5 rodents a day to survive. In this environment, that's easy. They hunt at dawn and dusk, crepuscular predators, taking advantage of the low light when rodents are most active, but larger predators are less effective. Their hearing is phenomenal. They can detect the ultrasonic squeaks of mice from dozens of feet away. Their eyes have a tapetum lucidum, a reflective layer that amplifies available light, letting them see in conditions that would leave other predators stumbling blind. They're perfectly adapted ambush hunters. Patient, silent, deadly. But here's what's crucial. They're not pack animals. They're not social. Each wildcat maintains a territory of several square miles. Males and females only come together briefly to mate, then go their separate ways. Mothers raise kittens alone for a few months, teaching them to hunt, then drive them off to find their own territories. This is not a species that cooperates. This is a species that tolerates absolutely zero competition for resources within its hunting grounds. Put 2 wildcats in the same territory, and they'll fight viciously until one leaves or dies. So why did they become domesticated when other wildcats didn't? The answer seems to be temperament, not friendliness exactly. Nobody's claiming these wildcats were naturally cuddly, but they had a higher tolerance for stress, a lower aggression threshold toward unfamiliar situations. When something changed in their environment, European wildcats fled or fought. African wildcats were more likely to watch and wait, to assess whether the change presented danger or opportunity. This tiny difference in baseline temperament was enough, because when humans started settling down in the Fertile Crescent, they created the opportunity of a lifetime for any wildcat bold enough to take it. The genetic studies that pinpointed this origin are remarkable pieces of scientific detective work. Researchers didn't just look at modern cats. They extracted DNA from archaeological cat bones found at ancient human settlements across the Near East, Europe, and Africa. Some of these bones were 9,000 years old. By comparing ancient and modern DNA, they could track how cats spread from their origin point. The data shows at least 5 distinct maternal lineages, 5 separate groups of African wildcats that contributed to the domestic cat gene pool. But all 5 groups lived in the same region, the Fertile Crescent in what's now Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Israel, and Jordan. Even more remarkably, the domestication process left barely any mark on cat genetics. This is completely different from dogs or sheep or cattle. Dog domestication involved massive genetic changes. Modern dogs look nothing like wolves. Their bones are different. Their brains are smaller. Their behavior is radically transformed. 30,000 years of selective breeding created hundreds of distinct breeds, each specialized for different tasks. Cats are basically still wild cats. A domestic cat and an African wildcat can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Their skeletons are nearly identical. Until about 200 years ago, you literally couldn't tell a domestic cat skeleton from a wild cat skeleton by looking at the bones alone. This tells us something profound about how cat domestication happened. It wasn't selective breeding. Not at first, not for thousands of years. Humans didn't capture wild cats and breed the tamest ones the way they did with wolves. Cats chose us, or more precisely, they chose the ecological niche we created. Think about what those early wildcats were like. Solitary, territorial, crepuscular hunters that spent most of the day sleeping in hidden spots, emerging at dawn and dusk to hunt. Their diet was almost entirely small rodents, supplemented occasionally with birds, lizards, or large insects. They were ambush predators, not pursuit hunters. They'd find a good spot near rodent trails or burrows, settling completely motionless for hours if necessary, then explode into action when prey appeared. The strike would last seconds. The meal would be consumed quickly, often in the same spot where the kill happened, then back to the resting spot to sleep and digest. They were also incredibly efficient predators. Studies of modern African wildcats in Africa show they have a hunting success rate of around 60%. That's extraordinary. Lions succeed maybe 25% of the time. Cheetahs, despite their incredible speed, only catch prey in about half their hunts. Wildcats, hunting creatures a fraction of their size in grass and brush, succeed more often than almost any other carnivore. This efficiency meant they didn't need huge territories if prey was abundant. In optimal conditions, a wildcat might maintain a territory of just 1 or 2 square kilometers. Now imagine what happens when humans start settling down, when they stop moving with the seasons and start building permanent settlements, when they start cultivating wheat and barley, storing harvested grain in granaries and storage pits, when they start creating the first concentrated year-round food sources in human history. The rodents notice immediately. Mice and rats have been following humans opportunistically for millennia, picking up scraps from campsites, raiding food stores. But permanent settlements with grain storage, that's paradise. Rodent populations explode around early agricultural villages. Archaeological evidence shows massive increases in commensal rodent species. Animals adapted to living alongside humans, right when permanent settlements appear. And the wild cats notice the rodents. A village with grain stores is surrounded by the highest density of prey these cats have ever encountered. More rodents in a 100-meter radius than they'd normally find in their entire territory. And they're easy to catch. Emboldened by abundance, careless around food sources. For a wildcat willing to overcome its natural wariness of humans, willing to hunt in the shadows around human settlements, the payoff is a windfall. So they came, not all at once, not as a species. Individual cats, bolder than average, hungry enough or curious enough to take the risk. They discovered that humans, busy with their crops and their pottery and their increasingly complex social lives, mostly ignored them, maybe occasionally threw stones if a cat got too close during daylight hours. But generally, humans tolerated them because the humans had noticed something too. Villages with cats had fewer rodents. Grain stores lasted longer. Disease spread less readily. Those early farmers didn't understand germ theory, didn't know that rodents carried plague and typhus and a dozen other deadly infections. But they understood cause and effect. Cats around meant fewer rats. Fewer rats meant more food survived to feed the village through winter. A partnership was forming. Not friendship yet, not trust, but mutual tolerance based on mutual benefit. The cats got easy hunting. The humans got pest control. And both species got something else, something neither could have predicted. They got each other. For the next 10,000 years, these two species were going to shape each other in ways that would eventually lead to cat videos getting 1 billion views on the internet. But that was far in the future. For now, in the early dawn light of the Neolithic Revolution, there were just a few wild cats creeping closer to human settlements, taking the first tentative steps toward a relationship that would carry them across the entire world. The age of the domestic cat was beginning. On the island of Cyprus, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary, a grave 9,500 years old, containing the remains of an adult human and a young cat buried together deliberately in what was clearly an intentional funeral. This is remarkable for several reasons. First, Cyprus has no native wild cats. Cats don't swim. The only way cats got to Cyprus was if humans brought them on boats, which means by 9,500 years ago, humans valued cats enough to transport them to new territories. Second, the burial suggests emotional attachment. You don't bury your pest control in a formal grave with grave goods unless you feel something for them. This wasn't just a working relationship anymore. This was the beginning of affection. Third, and perhaps most importantly, this burial predates the height of Egyptian cat worship by 6,000 years. The story of cats and humans didn't start in Egypt, as popular culture often suggests. It started much earlier, in the small farming communities of the Neolithic Revolution. From these early settlements, the partnership spread. As agriculture expanded across the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually Europe and Asia, cats followed, or rather, humans brought them. When founding new settlements, they brought grain, tools, livestock, and cats. Because by this point, cats weren't optional anymore. They were essential infrastructure. Without cats, your grain stores were vulnerable. With cats, you had a chance at preserving your harvest. The relationship was still fundamentally utilitarian. Cats were working animals, not companions. They lived around human settlements, but not necessarily inside human homes. They hunted for themselves, raised their kittens in hidden spots away from human interference, maintained much of their wild independence. But they were also becoming something new, more comfortable around humans than their wild ancestors, more diverse in coloration, as genetic mutations that would have been disadvantageous in the wild, making animals more visible to prey, didn't matter as much in an environment with abundant, easily caught rodents. Archaeological sites from across the ancient Near East show increasing evidence of cat remains alongside human settlements. Not as prey animals. The bones don't show butchery marks, but as residents. By 7,000 years ago, cat bones are common at farming sites from Turkey to Israel to Egypt. Some sites show cat paw prints in clay bricks that were left to dry in the sun. The cats walked across them casually, comfortable enough around humans to stroll through active work sites. By 6,000 years ago, artistic representations of cats start appearing. Figurines, carved decorations, wall paintings. Humans weren't just tolerating cats anymore. They were noticing them, thinking about them, incorporating them into their cultural expression. The stage was set for what would come next, for the civilization that would take the human-cat relationship to entirely new levels, that would transform cats from useful pest control into sacred animals, divine representatives walking among mortals. But that transformation was still thousands of years away. Around 2000 BC, something extraordinary began happening along the Nile River. The practical pest controllers that had been living in Egyptian grain stores for over 1,000 years started appearing in places that would have seemed impossible just a few generations earlier. Temple walls, royal tombs, religious ceremonies. The cats weren't just tolerated anymore. They were being worshipped. The transformation didn't happen overnight. The earliest Egyptian artwork showing cats dates to around 2500 BC. Simple paintings depicting them doing what they did best, hunting birds in papyrus marshes, sitting beneath grain storage facilities, looking alert and predatory. They were painted the same way you'd paint any useful animal, with appreciation for their function, but no particular reverence. But then something shifted. By 2000 BC, cats were being painted differently. Now they appeared wearing collars, sitting on chairs beside their owners, being hand-fed choice morsels of fish, and most tellingly, appearing in religious contexts, their images carved into temple walls alongside gods and pharaohs. What changed? Probably several things at once. After centuries of living alongside humans, cats had become more than pest controllers. They'd become companions. Egyptian families who'd grown up with cats protecting their food stores had developed genuine affection for them. Children had played with kittens. Adults had appreciated the comfort of a purring presence on cold desert nights. The practical relationship had become emotional, but there was something else. The Egyptians had started noticing things about cats that aligned eerily well with their religious beliefs. Cats were liminal creatures, active at dawn and dusk, moving between day and night. They could see in darkness when humans were blind. Their eyes seemed to glow in firelight. They were simultaneously gentle with their families and absolutely lethal to their prey. They killed snakes, including the venomous cobras that plague Egyptian homes. Most importantly, female cats were extraordinarily devoted mothers, fiercely protective of their kittens. To a civilization obsessed with divine duality, the balance between creation and destruction, protection and power, cats seemed like perfect vessels for the sacred. And so they began their transformation from useful animals to living gods. The goddess Bastet became the focal point of this transformation, though her origins were more complex and darker than many people realize. She didn't start as a cat goddess at all. Originally, she was depicted as a lioness, one of several fierce feline deities representing the destructive power of the sun and the pharaoh's military might. In her earliest forms, Bastet was nearly indistinguishable from Sekhmet, the terrifying lion goddess who almost destroyed humanity in ancient myth. But sometime around 1000 BC, Bastet began to change. The fierce lioness softened into a domestic cat, or a woman with a cat's head. Her role shifted from divine warrior to protector of homes, guardian of pregnant women, goddess of fertility and domesticity. This transformation mirrored the cat's own evolution in Egyptian society, from wild predator to household guardian. From feared hunter to beloved companion, the change wasn't random. It reflected a fundamental shift in Egyptian culture. As the new kingdom gave way to later periods, Egypt became less focused on military conquest and more concerned with domestic prosperity. The gods adapted to match human needs. Bastet became the perfect deity for this new era, powerful enough to protect, but gentle enough to love. Her worship centered on the city of Bastet in the Nile Delta, where a massive temple complex was dedicated to her honor. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus visited Bastet around 450 BC and left us one of the most detailed descriptions we have of Egyptian cat worship. He wrote with barely concealed astonishment about the annual festival of Bastet, claiming it was the largest religious gathering in Egypt. According to his account, 700,000 people would travel to Bastet for the celebration, arriving by boat with musicians, dancers, and copious amounts of wine. The festival was raucous, joyful, more carnival than solemn ceremony. People drank, sang, made offerings, and celebrated the goddess who protected their homes and blessed them with children. But the most remarkable thing about Bastet's temple wasn't the festival. It was the cats. Hundreds, possibly thousands of cats lived in the temple complex, cared for by priests and priestesses who considered it their sacred duty. These weren't wild animals barely tolerating human presence. They were cats who'd been raised for generations in religious service, bred specifically to embody the goddess. Pilgrims brought offerings for them, special foods, toys, even jewelry. Some of these temple cats wore elaborate collars of gold and precious stones. When they died, they were mummified with the same care given to human nobility. Which brings us to one of the strangest and most fascinating aspects of Egyptian cat worship, the mummies, millions of them. In the late 1800s, when European archaeologists first started seriously excavating Egyptian animal cemeteries, they were unprepared for the sheer scale of what they found. One site alone, the cat cemetery at Bastet, contained an estimated 300,000 mummified cats. Another site near Beni Hassan held hundreds of thousands more. The mummification wasn't crude or hasty. These cats were prepared using techniques similar to those used for human mummies, though less elaborate. Their internal organs were removed. Their bodies were treated with natron salt to preserve them. They were wrapped in linen, often with geometric patterns, and placed in specially made containers ranging from simple pottery jars to elaborate painted wooden coffins. Egyptian law protected cats with penalties that seemed wildly disproportionate to anything we consider reasonable today. Several ancient sources claim that anyone who killed a cat, even accidentally, could face the death penalty. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, described witnessing a Roman visitor who accidentally killed a cat being torn apart by an angry Egyptian mob, despite desperate attempts by Egyptian officials to save him. This might be exaggerated. The ancient historians loved a good dramatic story, but multiple sources mention similar incidents. The fear of harming cats was real and widespread. Archaeological evidence supports this. Egyptian artwork consistently shows cats in positions of comfort and privilege. Tomb paintings depict them sitting on cushioned chairs beneath their owners' seats at banquets, wearing jewel collars and eating from bowls. One famous painting shows a cat being hand-fed from a table laden with food, while birds hang overhead. Completely ignored because a cat is more important than maintaining the meat supply. These weren't working animals being given the bare minimum. They were family members being pampered. DNA evidence suggests something remarkable happened during this period. The cats living in Egypt around 1000 BC showed genetic signatures of intensive breeding and selection. The Egyptians weren't just keeping whatever wild cats wandered into their grain stores anymore. They were actively breeding cats, selecting for specific traits, probably temperament. Cats friendly enough to live comfortably with humans, possibly appearance, though we can't be certain what traits they valued, but definitely breeding them systematically, creating the foundation for what will become the domestic cat as we know it today. The temple complexes became breeding centers, with hundreds of cats living in close proximity, cared for by humans. Genetic diversity would have narrowed quickly. Certain lineages would have dominated. This is exactly what we see in the genetic record. A bottleneck around 1000 BC in the feline lineage that gave rise to most modern domestic cats. Not a crisis bottleneck like the one that nearly destroyed humanity, but a breeding bottleneck, the signature of intentional selection by human breeders. But Egypt jealously guarded its sacred cats. Recognizing their value, both religious and practical, Egyptian authorities attempted to ban the export of cats from Egypt. Traders who dealt in cats faced severe penalties. The goal was to keep these divine animals exclusively Egyptian, maintaining a monopoly on both their practical benefits and their religious significance. It didn't work. Of course it didn't work. Anytime a commodity becomes valuable and one group tries to monopolize it, smuggling becomes inevitable. Phoenician traders, notorious for moving anything profitable across the Mediterranean, started secretly transporting cats out of Egypt, hidden in cargo ships, concealed among other goods, probably breeding them on ships during long voyages. Greek merchants did the same. Roman traders followed. By 500 BC, cats that were almost certainly descended from Egyptian stock were appearing in Greece, Cyprus, and across the Mediterranean coast. The Egyptian religious monopoly on cats was breaking down, but in Egypt itself, the worship continued. Bastet remained one of the most popular deities right through the Ptolemaic period. Even as Greek culture mixed with Egyptian traditions after Alexander's conquest, the temple at Bastet continued operating. Pilgrims still came for festivals. Cats were still mummified by the thousands. Then Rome absorbed Egypt in 30 BC, and everything changed. Not immediately. The Romans were generally tolerant of local religions in their conquered territories, but they didn't share the Egyptian reverence for cats. To Roman sensibilities, the Egyptian obsession with felines seemed bizarre, possibly even ridiculous. They had their own sacred animals, and cats weren't among them. More importantly, Roman pragmatism clashed with Egyptian divine economics. The massive temple complexes with their thousands of priests caring for thousands of cats, all supported by tax revenues and donations, struck Roman administrators as wasteful. Over the next few centuries, funding for the temple complexes was gradually reduced. Priests moved to other occupations. The great festivals became smaller, less frequent, finally disappearing altogether. The cat cemeteries fell into disuse. By 400 AD, the worship of Bastet had essentially ended, suppressed partly by Roman practicality, and finally killed off by the rise of Christianity, which had no patience for animal worship of any kind. But the cats themselves survived. Centuries of breeding and selection had created an animal perfectly adapted to life alongside humans. They'd spread across the Mediterranean world. They'd lost their divinity, but they'd gained something equally valuable: ubiquity. The Egyptian experiment in cat worship was over, but the partnership between cats and humans refined and intensified along the Nile, would continue spreading across the globe. The descendants of Bastet's sacred hunters were about to conquer the world. The Phoenicians didn't set out to change the world when they smuggled cats out of Egypt. They were just solving a problem. Grain shipments across the Mediterranean were being destroyed by rats and mice. Simple economics. A cargo ship could carry enough wheat to feed a city for weeks. But if rodents got into the hold during a 3-week voyage, you arrived with half your profit eaten and the rest contaminated with droppings. The Phoenicians needed a solution, and they found one padding around the docks of Egyptian ports. Egyptian law technically prohibited the export of cats. They were sacred animals, property of the goddess Bastet, not commodities for foreign trade. But laws only work if you can enforce them. And the Mediterranean is a big place with a lot of coastline. Phoenician traders began acquiring cats, probably through a combination of theft, bribery, and strategic breeding of cats that had wandered away from Egyptian control. Within a few generations, Phoenician ships sailing out of Tyre and Sidon carried a secret weapon in their holds. Small, efficient, tireless hunters that worked for nothing more than the rats they caught. This was the first great feline diaspora. Not a planned colonization, not a deliberate introduction, but a practical necessity that happened to change the course of history. Every Phoenician trading post from Gibraltar to Carthage, from Sicily to the Levantine coast, every warehouse and granary that stored their goods became a potential cat habitat. And cats, being cats, didn't stay in the warehouses. They wandered into cities, bred in alleyways, and gradually became part of the urban ecosystem across the Mediterranean world. But this wasn't a rapid conquest. We're talking about centuries, maybe close to 1,000 years, for cats to spread from Egyptian exclusivity to Mediterranean commonality. The timeline was slow because cats face competition. Other animals had already filled the rodent control niche in most places, and they'd been doing it for a long time. In ancient Greece, cats were curiosities, not commonplace. If you were walking through Athens in the 5th century BC, you probably wouldn't see any cats. Maybe one or two kept by wealthy merchants with Mediterranean trading connections, displayed like exotic pets. The Greeks had ferrets. They domesticated them centuries earlier, trained them to hunt rats in grain stores and snakes in gardens. Ferrets were smaller, more easily controlled, and they had been part of Greek culture long enough to appear in artwork and literature. Weasels were even more common, semi-wild animals that people tolerated and sometimes encouraged around their properties because they killed rodents and snakes. So when cats started appearing in Greek ports, brought by Phoenician and later Roman traders, they weren't immediately embraced. They were foreign, associated with Egypt and its strange animal-worshipping religion, and they didn't do anything a good ferret couldn't do better. Or so the Greeks thought. But cats had advantages that became apparent over time. Ferrets needed cages, training, careful handling. Weasels were unpredictable, sometimes killing chickens or attacking small pets. Cats, remarkably, managed themselves. Feed them occasionally, and they'd stick around. Ignore them completely, and they'd still control your rodent problem. They were low-maintenance solutions to a persistent issue. Gradually, over centuries, Greek attitudes shifted. By the Hellenistic period, cats were appearing in Greek art, usually in domestic scenes, sometimes playing with balls of yarn or being fed by women and children. But Egypt jealously guarded its sacred cats. Recognizing their value, both religious and practical, Egyptian authorities attempted to ban the export of cats from Egypt. Traders who dealt in cats faced severe penalties. The goal was to keep these divine animals exclusively Egyptian, maintaining a monopoly on both their practical benefits and their religious significance. It didn't work. Of course it didn't work. Anytime a commodity becomes valuable and one group tries to monopolize it, smuggling becomes inevitable. Phoenician traders, notorious for moving anything profitable across the Mediterranean, started secretly transporting cats out of Egypt, hidden in cargo ships, concealed among other goods, probably breeding them on ships during long voyages. Greek merchants did the same. Roman traders followed. By 500 BC, cats that were almost certainly descended from Egyptian stock were appearing in Greece, Cyprus, and across the Mediterranean coast. The Egyptian religious monopoly on cats was breaking down, but in Egypt itself, the worship continued. Bastet remained one of the most popular deities right through the Ptolemaic period. Even as Greek culture mixed with Egyptian traditions after Alexander's conquest, the temple at Bubastis continued operating. Pilgrims still came for festivals. Cats were still mummified by the thousands. Then Rome absorbed Egypt in 30 BC, and everything changed. Not immediately. The Romans were generally tolerant of local religions in their conquered territories. But they didn't share the Egyptian reverence for cats. To Roman sensibilities, the Egyptian obsession with felines seemed bizarre, possibly even ridiculous. They had their own sacred animals, and cats weren't among them. More importantly, Roman pragmatism clashed with Egyptian divine economics. The massive temple complexes with their thousands of priests caring for thousands of cats, all supported by tax revenues and donations, struck Roman administrators as wasteful. Over the next few centuries, funding for the temple complexes was gradually reduced. Priests moved to other occupations. The great festivals became smaller, less frequent, finally disappearing altogether. The cat cemeteries fell into disuse. By 400 AD, the worship of Bastet had essentially ended, suppressed partly by Roman practicality, and finally killed off by the rise of Christianity, which had no patience for animal worship of any kind. But the cats themselves survived. Centuries of breeding and selection had created an animal perfectly adapted to life alongside humans. They'd spread across the Mediterranean world. They'd lost their divinity, but they'd gained something equally valuable: ubiquity. The Egyptian experiment in cat worship was over, but the partnership between cats and humans, refined and intensified along the Nile, would continue spreading across the globe. The descendants of Bastet's sacred hunters were about to conquer the world. The Phoenicians didn't set out to change the world when they smuggled cats out of Egypt. They were just solving a problem. Grain shipments across the Mediterranean were being destroyed by rats and mice. Simple economics. A cargo ship could carry enough wheat to feed a city for weeks. But if rodents got into the hold during a 3-week voyage, you'd arrive with half your profit eaten and the rest contaminated with droppings. The Phoenicians needed a solution, and they found one padding around the docks of Egyptian ports. Egyptian law technically prohibited the export of cats. They were sacred animals, property of the goddess Bastet, not commodities for foreign trade. But laws only work if you can enforce them. And the Mediterranean is a big place with a lot of coastline. Phoenician traders began acquiring cats, probably through a combination of theft, bribery, and strategic breeding of cats that had wandered away from Egyptian control. Within a few generations, Phoenician ships sailing out of Tyre and Sidon carried a secret weapon in their holds. Small, efficient, tireless hunters that worked for nothing more than the rats they caught. This was the first great feline diaspora. Not a planned colonization, not a deliberate introduction, but a practical necessity that happened to change the course of history. Every Phoenician trading post from Gibraltar to Carthage, from Sicily to the Levantine coast, every warehouse and granary that stored their goods became a potential cat habitat. And cats, being cats, didn't stay in the warehouses. They wandered into cities, bred in alleyways, and gradually became part of the urban ecosystem across the Mediterranean world. But this wasn't a rapid conquest. We're talking about centuries, maybe close to 1,000 years, for cats to spread from Egyptian exclusivity to Mediterranean commonality. The timeline was slow because cats face competition. Other animals had already filled the rodent control niche in most places, and they'd been doing it for a long time. In ancient Greece, cats were curiosities, not commonplace. If you were walking through Athens in the 5th century BC, you probably wouldn't see any cats. Maybe one or two kept by wealthy merchants with Mediterranean trading connections, displayed like exotic pets. The Greeks had ferrets. They domesticated them centuries earlier, trained them to hunt rats in grain stores and snakes in gardens. Ferrets were smaller, more easily controlled, and they had been part of Greek culture long enough to appear in artwork and literature. Weasels were even more common, semi-wild animals that people tolerated and sometimes encouraged around their properties because they killed rodents and snakes. So when cats started appearing in Greek ports, brought by Phoenician and later Roman traders, they weren't immediately embraced. They were foreign, associated with Egypt and its strange animal-worshipping religion, and they didn't do anything a good ferret couldn't do better. Or so the Greeks thought. But cats had advantages that became apparent over time. Ferrets needed cages, training, careful handling. Weasels were unpredictable, sometimes killing chickens or attacking small pets. Cats, remarkably, managed themselves. Feed them occasionally, and they'd stick around. Ignore them completely, and they'd still control your rodent problem. They were low-maintenance solutions to a persistent issue. Gradually, over centuries, Greek attitudes shifted. By the Hellenistic period, cats were appearing in Greek art, usually in domestic scenes, sometimes playing with balls of yarn or being fed by women and children. The unsung heroes of maritime trade, who made the entire feline diaspora possible. Every cat population outside Egypt ultimately descended from cats that had survived sea voyages. And surviving at sea wasn't easy. Ships were dangerous environments. Storms could wash animals overboard. Disease spread quickly in confined spaces. Food and fresh water were limited. But ships also had something cats desperately needed: rats. Massive populations of rats that bred in the holds, nested in the cargo, and spread disease throughout the crew. A good ship's cat could make the difference between a profitable voyage and a disaster. Merchants knew this. Captains knew this, and they selected for it. The cats that became ancestral to worldwide populations were the ones that could survive storms, tolerate weeks at sea without fresh water, hunt effectively in dark, confined spaces, and coexist with humans in extremely close quarters. These weren't typical cats. They were specialists bred and selected for maritime life over hundreds of generations, and their descendants, spreading from port to port, carried those adaptations with them. The cats that eventually colonized the entire world were already adapted to travel, to strange environments, to making themselves useful to humans in challenging conditions. They were, in a sense, pre-adapted for global conquest before the conquest even began. Then came the darkness. Picture a monastery in early medieval France, maybe around 700 CE. Dawn is breaking over stone walls that have stood for generations. In the grain storage rooms, a tabby cat pads silently between sacks of wheat, ears pricked forward, waiting. A mouse emerges. The cat pounces. One less threat to the monastery's winter food supply. The monks who pass by nod approvingly. This cat is doing God's work, protecting the harvest from vermin. For the first few centuries of medieval Europe, this was a normal relationship between cats and humans. Practical, valued, unremarkable. Cats lived in monasteries, on farms, in the homes of merchants and nobles. They weren't particularly beloved, not like they had been in ancient Egypt, but they were useful. That was enough. The Benedictine rule, written in the 6th century, didn't specifically mention cats, but monastic records from across Europe show they were common residents of religious houses. Cats in the scriptorium, keeping mice away from precious manuscripts. Cats in the kitchen, protecting food stores. Cats in the barns, earning their keep with every rat they caught. Some monasteries even kept official records of their cat populations, listing them alongside livestock and other valuable property. In the Islamic world, this practical appreciation deepened into genuine reverence. The Prophet Muhammad was said to have loved his cat Muetza so much that when the call to prayer came and Muetza was sleeping on the sleeve of his robe, Muhammad cut off the sleeve rather than disturb the cat. Whether historically accurate or not, this story shaped Islamic attitudes toward cats for over 1,000 years. In medieval Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, cats wandered freely through mosques and markets, protected by religious law and cultural tradition. Stray cats were fed by charitable foundations. Harming a cat could bring serious social consequences. But in Christian Europe, something was shifting, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but gathering momentum like a storm building on the horizon. The change had roots in theology, in politics, in the peculiar anxieties of medieval Christianity.